welcome to Railfans. I'm Shane Seguin. Join us as we discover Ottawa's O train, Toronto's subway, and Montreal's metro system together. I'm Shane Seguin, and joining me today is Seth McDermott, who's a Toronto transit enthusiast. The Scarborough RT is long past its shelf life, as you've very clearly mentioned, and there's been many options over the past 10, 20 years of what would come next. Would it be expanded? Would it be replaced? Would it be upgraded? Can you talk a little bit about what options have been proposed and a bit about the timeline as to how it's evolved over time and nothing really became of it until the point now we're at 2021 where the line is going to be decommissioned in the next couple of years?
Well, the question is how far back you want to look when we start talking about options, because really discussions on the line's future started in the late 2000s, around the time that 20-year clock flipped over, and now the line was recognized to be kind of living on borrowed time. So there was discussion around, well, should we invest in new train technology? That was like obviously the very beginning, the outset, well, what's available in the linear induction space now? And very quickly it became clear that none of the options that were on the table at the time, or still nowadays, would do the job. Because, like I said, everything was longer than the existing trains, everything was heavier than the existing trains, which is a big issue on the elevated portion of the line at Kennedy Station, and then between just west of Midland and the end of the line at McCowan. Those elevated portions, you really see that those guideways are not meant to hold very much weight. And so the existing, Mark II, Mark III options were kind of put off the table pretty quickly. Then there was the question around it being, well, should it be a subway extension? Should Scarborough finally get the subway that it had been asking for decades? Or should it be converted into what the original plan for the Scarborough RT was going to be, which is essentially taking a page from streetcars and using LRT technology, but a more modern, up-to-date version of that, where it wouldn't be the single-sided streetcar with a high floor and going around a loop, but sorry, when I say high floor, I mean like steps down to a platform, like the kind of inaccessible version that was originally supposed to be on that line with the CLRV streetcar, but have a level boarding situation, whatever that might be. So both of those options were really on the table, and it went back and forth quite a bit in the late 2000s, early 2010s. Part of that had to do with the election of Rob Ford in 2010, which set the city's transit expansion into kind of a tailspin for a while, because he, of course, got elected on a platform of everything being subways, and that streetcars were like the enemy, light rail was not to be used anywhere. There was a lot of sort of acrimony in the city at the time. Now, the idea of it being a light rail line started as it being its own thing. Like, that was how the late 2010s plan was supposed to pan out, and it really got developed as part of what was that broader effort in the late 2000s, in the Miller era, the Transit City Plan, which was going to see these LRTs built across the city in various places. So Eglinton, Finch West was part of that plan, as well as lines that have since not come to fruition. Like, there was going to be an LRT on Don Mills they wanted to put. There was going to be one on Jane, which is still kind of up in the air as a question. Could happen. We'll see. And they wanted to have this sort of nexus of LRT lines spreading out from Kennedy Station. They wanted Eglinton to come to Kennedy. They wanted a line that would continue actually east along Eglinton, but they planned it as a separate service, probably due to the length of the line. If you would stitch everything along Eglinton together, it'd be like really long. So they broke it at Kennedy. And then they had this third line, which was supposed to take over the Scarborough RT and go up to Scarborough Centre and then continue on from there. But after the tables got turned with Rob Ford canceling Transit City on the first day he got into position as mayor, there was a big question around like what would happen to the Scarborough RT now that it had the rug pulled out from under it. There, for a time, was consideration of merging the Eglinton line and the Scarborough RT into one light rail line. Eglinton was the one light rail line that was going to be allowed to proceed, even under Rob Ford, just due to the fact that a large portion of it was underground through the center of the city, so it wouldn't be taking up median space, and that a lot of the planning for it had already been done, and Toronto has had a unfortunate history of canceling a number of projects while they were already in, if not the research and development phase, like with the Go ALRT, even so far as to cancel a subway line that was already starting construction, the Eglinton line back in the 90s under the Harris government. So not wanting to kind of repeat that situation, Eglinton was going to be allowed to proceed. But the idea was to stitch Scarborough and Eglinton together into this one super line. That lasted for a few years, and then it was reverted back to the Scarborough RT remaining a separate service, which I think was for the better, personally, just because stitching together the service needs and frequency and everything of Eglinton with the Scarborough RT and having this gap in the middle of that line that uses a median running operation between the central part of Eglinton, which is underground, and the Scarborough portion, which is not underground, but it is grade separated, just creates these like weird issues of how to manage such a line and have it operate at rapid transit level standards. So at that point, then the question was really, do we have it be a separate LRT on its own, or do we have it as a subway? And of course, Ford was very in favor of it being a subway, and a subway is what we're going to end up getting. There was a big debate in City Council about what to do one way or the other. There was even a fund created where there's like a tax levy to create the Scarborough subway extension out of the city's coffers. And then just when it seemed like the table might turn again and it might end up going back to the LRT option being seriously considered, Doug Ford was elected as Premier of Ontario, and he took up his younger brother's cause of making a bunch of suburban subway extensions. And chief among those, one of the biggest planks in his election platform, even when he was campaigning in 2018, was the Scarborough subway as an extension of Line 2. And that plan has sort of oscillated back and forth a couple times as to how many stations they wanted to put on a line and what alignment they wanted it to take, but they were very clear throughout that process that they wanted it to be a subway. And that was really cemented when the province threatened to upload the entire TTC subway system to provincial ownership, which they have unilateral legal right to do, given that cities are creatures of the province, as the Supreme Court ruling indicated, and as sort of a bargaining chip to keep the existing subway in city hands, the city made kind of a deal, not necessarily the best to support the city's position on it, but it was kind of I would say the best option they had on the table at the time, which was the city could get to keep the existing subway network, and the province would then take over ownership and responsibility for all of the new extensions that were being proposed. Not necessarily every new extension for the rest of time, let's just be clear about that, but all of the 4 extensions that were on the table, Scarborough being really important in that plan. The other key ones being the Relief Line, which became the Ontario Line, the Yonge North extension to Richmond Hill, and the Eglinton West extension of the crosstown toward Pearson Airport. So subway is what we ended up with. And the debate around the alignment mainly had to do with how to not have the subway compete too much or cannibalize ridership too much from the Stouffville GO train line, which the Scarborough RT runs directly parallel to between Kennedy and Ellesmere. And so we ended up with an alignment that doesn't use any of the existing RT infrastructure, totally new, completely underground, and running under Eglinton and then Danforth Road / McCowan Road to get up to Scarborough Centre and then carrying on to Shepherd and McCowan. So the entire RT infrastructure is going to be decommissioned as an active transit service. None of the existing line will be reclaimed for the new extension, and that had a lot to do with the alignment of the subway when it pulls into Kennedy. Essentially, that curve that I had mentioned about the RT having to leave Kennedy Station to make this immediate sharp turn to the north, well, the subway platform is directly parallel to the RT platform, 3 levels underground, and you can't turn a subway train nearly that sharply, so it would have to make this giant curve under the neighborhood, like a reversed curve, to get back to the RT alignment. It would sort of overshoot and have to return. And so you'd already be losing a significant portion of the existing right-of-way. So there's sort of no point to that. Or the other alternative, which would be to completely rebuild Kennedy Station entirely to allow the subway to take up the RT alignment, which wasn't considered a viable proposal. So instead, the subway just takes a completely different course its own way.
The line is now definitively going to be closing in 2023. There were a few options that were floated and tossed around as far as what could be done in the interim to bridge the gap of service until the new Line 2 extension into Scarborough was going to open around 2030. So can you talk a little bit about these options that they had considered and ultimately what was chosen?
Part of the entire reason why a subway extension was considered that would take a path different than the existing RT alignment, in addition to what I mentioned around the physical clearances of the track not being very amenable to running a subway, was that they wanted to avoid a situation where there would be a gap in service between the RT needing to close and the subway opening. It's kind of ironic that we've found ourselves in this situation now where not only are we looking at a very expensive subway extension running on a totally different alignment, but also a multi-year gap between the closing of the existing LRT or Scarborough RT and the opening of the subway extension. So some of the options that have been proposed in order to help bridge that time period, the TDC considered a range of possibilities, one of which they actually did look at the possibility of purchasing Mark I trains from Vancouver. They reported on it earlier in 2021, this year, and that option was considered not to be viable because the Mark I trains in Vancouver are expected to also reach their end of life before the subway extension would be open. So you'd be dealing with shipping those trains from Vancouver to Toronto, outfitting them with all of the TTC systems, including having a staff member be able to drive the train, because don't forget the Vancouver trains don't have a proper cab, and still only get 3 or 4 years of life out of them when the gap between the RT closing and the new subway extension opening is going to be at least 7 years. So they kind of decided that they would be just stuck in the same position 4 years from now and that it wouldn't be worth it. Other options have included running buses either on street or actually using the existing RT alignment to run some sort of busway. There was actually recently a community survey about that. It just closed in mid-July 2021 that put those options in front of the community, and we'll see what the results of that survey say. But it included options to to put bus service on streets, on a variety of streets in the area, in addition to actually using the RT alignment. The question is still up in the air as to how much of the existing RT alignment they'd even be able to use. The survey had mentioned the possibility of using the elevated portion between Midland and McCowan, but it also acknowledged that that might not be possible because the guideway is, again, designed to handle a certain kind of vehicle. It's not really built for like heavy weights, first of all, and now a bus doesn't add a lot of weight. But the issue would be trying to retrofit the existing guideway to have a road surface, because the existing guideway, it's sort of created like a trench. There's two parallel trenches, one for each track, and so the trenches are quite narrow because they're meant to hold a train. It's hard to drive a bus at any kind of speed and avoid bashing against the sides of those trenches, and then also to build a road surface in there on top of what had been a track bed adds this question of, well, what's the dead weight of that going to be? So it's very unclear whether or not any of the existing guideway would be able to be used on the elevated portion, or whether it would just end up getting spat back out onto the street at Ellesmere anyway, and what the retrofit cost of all of that would be. And also that if you use the LRT, I keep saying LRT, if you use the RT alignment, you would still have at least a few months of construction in there where you'd have to use on-street operation, because the RT is going to shut down and then they have to rip out all the rails and put a road down so the buses could drive on. So you are going to be stuck with on-street operation for at least a portion of that service. And the question is just, what makes the most sense? Do you build bus lanes on a city street nearby and just pump everything through that, or do you try to somehow recycle the existing guideway alignment? My personal money is on an on-street alignment for the duration of the closure. I think it just creates a lot less complication in terms of how to potentially reuse that existing guideway. Especially the elevated portion. I doubt that would really go anywhere. And that's just me talking. That's my engineering brain coming into play, thinking about like what all the logistics of that kind of conversion would be, and that's just not something that I see the TTC or the city really wanting to sink a lot of money into, considering how expensive and complex the existing operation is already going to be, and also given the success of the Rapid TO bus lane program, which you see on Eglinton Avenue in Scarborough right now, where with a few cans of paint and a weekend, they've managed to greatly improve the throughput and the reliability of bus service along Eglinton Avenue East and Kingston Road, and I think that provides sort of a useful analog for the TTC to justify the case for making on-street busways, both to the public who have now had a chance to experience what the busway on Eglinton is like, but also to the city government. That the council would consider it a credible option to employ after the RT shuts down. Now, obviously, it would be carrying a high volume of people. The TTC wants to extend not every single bus route, but the majority of bus routes serving Scarborough Centre, and just pump them straight through to Kennedy. And they estimated that would produce a peak frequency of approximately one bus per minute, which is quite heavy service. And so part of the question around what street to use or what alignment to use for this interim service is just to consider what that would be like for anyone living along that street, or any businesses along that street, to have more or less a continuous river of buses, similar to what you'd see with a subway shuttle, but just for 7 or 8 years nonstop.
So in the next couple of years, Line 3 Scarborough RT is going to fade into the annals of transit history in Toronto, much like Lower Bay Station has all but disappeared. What do you think is going to happen to the guideway, to the trains, to pretty much all the infrastructure that's visible from Kennedy into Scarborough?
Yeah, it's an interesting question what they're going to do with the line. The TTC actually put that forward in the same survey where they were asking what people wanted to see done as far as the interim transit service goes, because the guideway and the even the at-grade portion of the route are obviously directly implicated in what the future transit service options might be. But beyond the end of that, what would be sort of the permanent disposition of that line? Personally, I would be interested in seeing it become sort of a trail or a public space of some kind, rather than it completely vanishing. Just because the area that the RT connects right now, it currently is quite industrial. There's a lot of, asphalt and concrete, not a lot of accessible travel routes for pedestrians, cyclists, any other sort of users besides, if you're in a car. And that was one of the options the TTC put forward is like, should this route become some sort of a public trail, public space, place for people to experience after the line closes? And then what should be done with the station buildings? Should they be completely demolished or should they be turned into some sort of community space? I think it presents a real opportunity. It's a really interesting opportunity to reimagine what some of those spaces could be. As a transit enthusiast, transit fan, I would hate to see the line completely vanish from existence. I'd love to see the existing station buildings turned into something useful, something that people can experience both maybe a repurposed use, but also recognize the historical purpose of that space, and be able to experience the kind of living history of the city. So I think that's what I'd like to see happen with the line. Obviously, that's just my personal hope. And then the vehicles, I really don't know. It would be nice to see some of them go to museums. I mean, this is a very historic line in terms of, it showed a lot of the research and development effort that the Ontario government really wanted to put forward in the late 20th century. It really was an achievement, despite all of the sort of shortcomings that have materialized as the line has been aging. It really was a groundbreaking development, and so to see that line commemorated in some way, to see the vehicles retained in some way, whether that's, I don't know what transit museums would be able to take them or what they would do about the fact that they're linear induction. They'd probably have to convert them, so they sort of lose one of the defining characteristics that made it so innovative in the first place. But it'd be nice to not have them completely just vanish into history. I think I think some parts of it should remain.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us today about the Scarborough RT. Definitely a historical and technologically significant line that's been part of Toronto history for over 30 years now. Seth McDermott, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.